In January, February, and March, I finished a total of 11 books and I grabbed every single chapter I read. Now I know I'm late and we're well into April, but I still wanted to give you guys a proper reading wrap up. So hopefully you guys will get a better idea of which ones you want to read and which ones you want to skip. If you're new here, this is Laura Plus Books, where I'll yap your ear off about fantasy and sci-fi reads. So let's get right into it. Out of the 11 books, I finished 3 and I DNFed 3 and I finished 8. So not the best ratio, and I honestly would have loved to have read closer to 12 or 13 books at this point of the year. So I'm a little bit disappointed, but we can't put too much pressure on ourselves, especially when reading is just a hobby. Sometimes life just comes first and that's okay. So let's start with the very first book I picked up in 2026, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. So this follows Addie, who in a moment of desperation makes a bargain to live forever, but at the cost of never being remembered by anyone she meets. Now this first happens in France in 1714, and after 300 years, she finally meets someone who remembers her. So for the chart with this one, I didn't realize I wanted to rate every single chapter just yet, but I did rate every 100 pages. So we still get an idea of how my enjoyment levels change over the course of this book. Now you'll realize the first 100 pages start off great with a 4.5 star. The first thing I really noticed was how incredible the writing was. It's flowery and it's poetic, but it's not hard to follow, which I find rare for me in particular. The structure was incredible as well. As I mentioned, it goes between that past and present timeline, and it really feels like she stays in each timeline for a really good amount of time. She really uses show don't tell in both the timelines to help build the world and the character. And so even though the pace was a little bit slower, like it's not an action-packed story or anything, I just could not put this book down. I will say I did slightly prefer the present day timeline over the past timeline, but I don't think that was any detriment to the reading experience for me. And I had noted at about 400 pages that it kind of just felt like I hadn't even blinked. Like I just flew through the first part of this book. I also loved the illustrations in this book. Let me see if I can find one. This is just the first piece of art here, and there's only a few throughout the whole book, but they all represent a piece of art and it kind of links back to the story, which I loved. This started my year off with a bang. It was a 5-star overall for me, even though the overall rating of each 100 chapter doesn't equal out to 5-star. But I already know this is gonna be one of my top reads of the year. It's an all-time favorite already. It feels like top tier magical realism, and it definitely makes me want to read more from the genre and more from the author. I somehow have never read anything from V.E. Schwab. This is my first book from her, and I definitely want to start a darker shade of magic soon after loving this one so much. And I also have a full reading vlog with this book and The Raven Scholar, which I'll talk about more later. But if you wanted to see my reactions while reading the books, you can check that out after this video. Okay, the next thing I finished in 2026 was actually a short story. This was number 6 and the final short story in a collection called The Time Traveler's Passport. And this is a sci-fi collection. Amazon actually releases one every year with some of the top authors in the space. So this is Cronus by P.J. Clark. Let me check how to pronounce that. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's P.J. Clark. Now I don't have a graph for this since it's a short story and I pretty much finished it in 1 or 2 sittings, I think. But my overall rating for this was 5 out of 5 stars. The year was off to such a great start, but foreshadowing that does not last. But anyway, back to Cronus. So this is set in 2030. Our main character is Annabeth, and she works at a company called Cronus that offers time travel as an experience to wealthy customers, typically white customers. Now, Annabeth is Black, and the short story uses the time travel medium to explore racism and inequality in a really unique way. It was unsettling and dark at times, but every single word, every single page felt super meaningful and purposeful, which I think is so important, especially when the story is in such a small package. And I had this problem with some of the other short stories in the collection where it was either not doing enough or trying to do way too much. And I felt like this was the perfect balance where it packed a punch and it hooked you in. This is the only thing I've read from him. I haven't read any of his actual novels, but now I'm super interested. So if you have read anything by him, definitely let me know what you thought. I've heard a few things about Ring Shout, but I haven't heard much else. Our next one is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. This is a 2025 debut fantasy, the first in a new series. In this one, 7 contenders are competing to take the throne, but one of the contenders is murdered. That's when our main character, Nima, the Emperor's High Scholar, has to both investigate the murder and replace the murdered contender, all while trying to stay alive herself. So I'm looking back at the graph now, and it was a little bit up and down, but mostly up. A lot of 5-star chapters there with just a couple that were 2 stars. Now the first half of this was quite dense. It's a completely new world and it has an academic setting. There was a lot of world building and a lot of characters to keep up with. So there were a few moments that got a bit slow for me, but overall the world building felt quite natural. There didn't feel like there were any major info dumps or anything like that. And there was a little bit of a low point right in the middle, but after that we really hit the peak and it was a straight run of 5 stars for a while. All the interludes and fables that were part of the world building earlier on that kind of felt slow before now started to make sense, and a lot of the plot points started to click into place for me. Now the only other thing is that the ending wasn't perfectly satisfying for me, but I am still very excited for book 2. Overall, all the chapters averaged out to 4.27 stars, and I ended up rounding this up to 4.5 stars just after considering the overall impression that it left on me. So I definitely think this deserves all the hype and rave reviews that it's getting. I highly recommend getting started, especially while only the first book is out. Is it getting dark? No, that looks all right. Now let's talk about our first DNF of the year, The Gate of the Feral Gods by Matt Dinniman. This is book 4 in the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, and if you haven't heard about this before, in this series, Earth has been transformed into an 18-level dungeon, and our main character, Carl, and his ex-girlfriend's cat, Princess Donut, have to enter this deadly competition that's being televised to an intergalactic audience. It's a super fun setup and I adored the first book. It was a 5-star, a favorite in the year that I read it. I've been listening to this series on audiobook as well, and the narrator Jeff Hayes does an absolutely incredible job. However, after book 2, it started going downhill. Each book just got a lower and lower rating until book 4 ended with a DNF. Now, even though I did say I loved the narration, I have heard some people say that doing it on audiobook made them struggle to really connect with the story and empathize with the characters. So I'm wondering if that's my problem with it, but I'm not too sure. But my major issues were the fact that I felt like the story lacked a lot of heart. Things started feeling quite repetitive to me, and I honestly just didn't really care about what was going to happen next. When I first DNF'd this, I was pretty sure that I was going to come back to it, but now that there's been a little bit more time, I more and more just don't feel interested. I remember every time I posted my thoughts after book 2, 3, and after this, people would keep being like, the next book is better, just stick it out. But I feel like I've just invested too much time at this point and I just need to move on to a different series. So very sad to say this was my first DNF of the year. Also, I don't have a graph for this one because I was listening to it on audiobook and it just felt like too hard to have to write down my rating after each chapter. But on a better note, we have another Matt Dinniman book that I actually loved. This is Operation Bounce House. It's a new sci-fi standalone from him, and this is about our main character Oliver, who's grown up on a completely different planet that humans had colonized called New Sonara. He was born there and it's the only home he's ever known. Everyone was promised that there would be peace, when out of nowhere, people from Earth started building war machines that they control from their own home, and Oliver has to start defending the only home he's ever known. After DNFing the Dungeon Crawler Carl series, this was exactly what I needed. It felt like there was so much more heart to it, and because it was a standalone, it didn't feel like anything was getting repetitive as well. This is definitely my most up and down chart so far, but for the most part, it was pure chaos, so much action, so much fun. The humor in this was top tier, and there's also a lot of great commentary on gamer culture and just culture in general at the moment as well. It felt very of the times. Now, it's not necessarily a quotable book, so I don't think the prose is the standout at all here, but the writing still hooks you in. Now, looking back at the graph, so I can say that most of the high moments were the chapters that had a lot of emotional moments. I felt like those were done really well. And the chapters that were rated a bit lower was usually because some characters felt a little bit shallow. And I also had this issue where I felt like he tried to portray certain professions, and I am unsure whether he did any research or spoke to anyone that actually worked in those professions. So I think that contributed to the fact that some of the characters felt so one-dimensional as well. But my final average for all the chapters in this was 3.97. So overall, I gave this a 4-star. So whether you liked Dungeon Crawler Carl or not, I definitely recommend picking this up. It's bingeable, it's funny, and actually heartfelt. Now, unfortunately, we're moving back into another DNF. We have The Light of All That Falls by James Islington, which is book 3 in the Licanius trilogy. I only have book 1 here. But if you haven't heard about this series, the first book essentially follows our main character, Davian, and he's in school trying to learn how to control the powers of the gifted. Now, this is when he discovers he actually holds the forbidden power of the Augurs, which I actually don't know if that's how you're meant to say it, but that's how I read it in my head. And him discovering this forbidden power sets in motion a whole bunch of different storylines, a whole bunch of different chains of events, and this definitely feels like a really traditional adventure-focused epic fantasy. Now, this first book, The Shadow of What Was Lost, was a decent 4 stars. It felt a little bit clunky, but overall really intriguing. Book 2, An Echo of Things to Come, was even better. I gave it a 4.5 stars. I loved it. And so I was incredibly sad when book 3, The Light of All That Falls, ended up being a DNF for me. So without any spoilers, my main problem with book 3 was it felt like there was so much new lore that was being introduced. A lot of it felt like it was coming out of nowhere. It felt like info dump after info dump. And I just feel like the last book in a trilogy shouldn't be like that. I was kind of hoping to start seeing existing plot lines start to wrap up, start to come together. And instead, I just got really bored and didn't want to pick the book up at all. However, it is the last book in a trilogy, so it really pains me to have to DNF it. And I do want to find out what happens. So this is still a soft DNF for me. I may want to come back to it when I might be in a better mood for it. And then we move in to yet another DNF, which, my goodness, it was a bad time for reading for me. We have Annihilation by VanderMeer. This is set in a place called Area X that's been cut off from human civilization, and people have consistently tried to send expeditions to discover the mysteries of this place, with failure after failure. And this follows the 12th expedition, and it's written in journal format. And at first, I really loved it. It felt like we were following a real person's journey. The atmosphere and tone were built up really well. It was ominous and unsettling, kind of felt like an unreliable narrator. And it also reminded me a little bit of the narrator from I Who Have Never Known Men, but even more eerie and uncomfortable. I only had 1 rating since there's only a few chapters in this book. It's literally so short. I can't believe I DNF'd to such a short book, but that really shows how I just could not get through it. But yeah, the first chapter of this I gave 3 stars, and then in the second chapter, that's when I DNF'd it. I felt like I had to turn my brain onto full max power to understand what was going on. I had to keep reading paragraphs over and over. It was overly descriptive, which did help to make the world more vivid, but I felt like it was kind of to its detriment rather than being a positive. The world building just felt really dense and tiresome. It also made me feel super creeped out. So I think maybe this just isn't the right book for me. I know a lot of people love this book. So if a kind of eerie, mysterious short read sounds interesting to you, I would still check it out, but yeah, not for me. Now, luckily, we're moving into a book that I actually did enjoy. We have Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. Now, I would maybe describe this as a dystopian, not sure if that's what it's actually classed as, but it is a standalone, and Chain Gang All-Stars is a super popular but also highly controversial program where American prisoners have to fight to the death for the prize of their freedom. And we finally have a chart to look at since this is not a DNF and it's not an audiobook. The opening chapters for this were absolutely incredible. I was immediately hooked. I loved the main characters and wanted to know more straight away. But then we started to have a few lower chapters. I actually noted that I considered DNFing it at around chapter 5 or 6, which I'm so glad I didn't. But the reason for that was after introducing the world of the main characters, we started seeing perspectives from all different sides of the Chain Gang All-Stars. So, for example, we saw people protesting against the program, we saw newscasters, we saw fans of the program as well. So this all contributed to setting the scene and understanding the world, but I kind of felt like I just wanted to get back into it. But even though those chapters weren't necessarily page turners, they did get more and more intriguing as time went on. They were also all extremely thought-provoking, which I loved. And you'll see on the chart eventually my first 5-star chapter. And this is when it felt like we were finally getting back into the main story. The focus was back on the main characters and the plot was finally starting to pick up for me. And then in the last third or so, all the parts that felt kind of slower at the beginning started to come together, and I understood why we needed to have those slower world building moments. And then as you can see, the last few chapters were pretty much all 5 stars. Another note I had for the whole book was I thought the way the women were written was incredible. There was also great intersectionality throughout the whole thing. And I honestly thought the author was a woman the whole time. And I was so impressed to find out that it was actually a man. So overall, the average of the chapters was 4.26 out of 5. I ended up rating it a 4 stars just because of the slightly slower moments at the beginning, but I highly recommend picking this up. It's definitely a very solid 4 stars. Next book we have is A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Guin. I have a huge collection version here with all the books in the series. This one is about a young wizard called Sparrowhawk who in his youth, because of his greed and his hunger for power, ends up setting loose a terrible shadow on the world that he has to try and defeat. Now, this is, I believe, one of the first fantasy books that was ever written, so I do want to give it some grace because of that. It feels very much like a classic, almost middle grade fantasy, which makes sense because I'm sure a lot of future fantasies took inspiration from this structure. And now it felt very cliche, which is kind of silly to say because that's probably just because everything else written after this took inspiration from this, and that's how the cliche was born. So at the time that she wrote this, it wasn't a cliche, but that was my first note on the book. Now, my second problem with this book was a lot of the conflicts and complications in this book were bred from problems with the main character's ego. So I found the main character very unlikable. He also did remind me a bit of Fitz from the Farseer trilogy, who I also didn't like, but a lot of other people do love him. So maybe my negative thoughts on this book in particular is just a me thing. There were also no politics or really compelling complications in the book. So the whole thing kind of felt like a bit of a drag for me. But even though it feels like I only had bad things to say about it, it wasn't terrible. The writing was still good and it was still engaging enough for me to finish the whole thing. Now, in this edition that I have, there's also a foreword from Ursula Guin where she talks about discovering feminism for the first time after having written the first couple books in the series. And she talks about realizing the lack of women in her story. And so she then goes on to write more books in this series where the main characters are female. And so because of that, I'm very intrigued. And I also just want to see how her writing develops over time, since the series is written over like 20, 30 years, if I'm not wrong. So overall, the chapters averaged to about 2.9 stars, and I rounded that up to a 3-star. Definitely don't regret reading it, and I'm excited to see what the rest of the series has in store. It's getting dark. I hope you guys can still see me. We only have 2 more books to talk about. So next we have Ancillary Justice by Leckie. This is book 1 in the Imperial Ratch series trilogy. Now I also want to mention that this book won the 2014 Hugo, Nebula and Arthur C. Clarke Awards, which was definitely part of why I was so interested in picking it up. This is set on a remote icy planet and it follows our main character Breck, who actually used to be called the Justice of Torren when she was a starship, like an AI starship, but she now lives in a human body. But let's have a look at the graph now. So the pacing was pretty consistent throughout, and you'll see that there are only a few low moments here and there. For the most part, it kind of hovers around that 4-star mark. There are 2 timelines, one where Breck is still a starship and one where she's a human. And I, for the most part, found the present timeline more interesting. So those are usually the chapters that are 4 stars or above, and then the past timelines are usually the ones that are a bit lower. And the past timelines are also the ones that have a bit more world building, which is why they felt a little bit slower to me. Now, I think the thing that really stopped me from giving this 5 stars throughout was I couldn't quite empathize with the main character completely. I feel like her motivations, her goals weren't that clear to me. And so it was a bit hard for me to completely root for her. But overall, I did really enjoy it. The plot was great, the pacing was great, as I mentioned, and I definitely want to continue the series. Now, I do have a quick small rant. So a lot of people have issues with how gender is portrayed in this series. And so in the Ratch culture that Breck is from, gender isn't really a thing. And so Breck defaults to calling everyone she, but then when we come across people from other cultures, you'll see that they'll be calling the same characters he. And people get really mad that the default gender is she, but I just feel like that wouldn't have been an issue if the default was he, and maybe it should have been they, but that's just not how the culture, this fictional culture, evolved. And I think if you read this and you get confused, like, what gender is this character? Like, I think the point is that it just doesn't matter. But anyway, overall, I averaged out the ratings for all the chapters and it came out to 3.91, and I rounded this up to a 4-star. I don't know if it quite deserves all the awards that it won, but maybe this was just the best sci-fi book that was released in that year. And I'm very interested to see if the rest of the series will be even better for me. Okay, and the last book we have to talk about is Mort by Terry Pratchett. This is part of the Discworld universe, but it's the first book in the Death series within that universe, and it's the first Discworld book that I've read. Now, Death is the Grim Reaper in Discworld. He's the classic Grim Reaper and he ushers souls into the next world. However, he's yearning to experience what the human world has to offer, and so he has to find someone to help him with his work. That's when he offers a job to our main character, Mort, and he gives him an offer he can't refuse. And this book kind of has a whimsical, childlike feel to it. It kind of reminds me a bit of Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a middle grade, but it kind of felt like that to me. I listened to this on audiobook and the narration was great. It was funny in kind of a goofy way and the characters were super charming and sweet. However, the plot didn't quite hook me. I wasn't really convinced by the stakes, and now that I've finished this book, I don't really feel the need to read anything more in this universe. Now, in saying that, the Discworld universe has a huge cult following, so I'm not sure if maybe this was just the wrong entry point for me. So if you have read any of the series, let me know what your thoughts are, if maybe I should give any of the other books a go before I completely give up on this series. Now again, since this was read on audio, I didn't chart every chapter, but overall I gave it a 3-star. Again, I don't regret reading it. It was definitely above average and well written, but just not super engaging or compelling for me. And that's all the books I read and DNF'd in the first 3 months of the year. I'm currently reading The Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of The Lord of the Rings, so make sure you subscribe so you can see my thoughts on that. And if you want to see what the rest of my April reading plans look like, you can check out my last video where I let a random wheel pick my TBR. So I'll see you guys over there, or I'll see you guys next time.